So the superficial front line, as you might expect, is pretty much a balance to the superficial back line. So instead of starting on the back side of the toes, we're going to start on the front side of the toes with extensor hallucis and extensor digitorum longus, and we pick up the tibialis anterior here from the inside, and we go right over to the knee, like that. But hey, does that look like it? Especially if you look at it from the side? No, not quite. Because if we had muscles that went like that, they'd have great leverage on our toes, but they would, we'd have to have skin that went all the way out around to here. So God took this extra little piece of fascia and strapped it around here like that, so that all the muscles of the superficial front line go under this pulley on their way to the toes or the inside edge of the foot there. Now the retinaculum, which you can see here as a separate structure, and you usually see it in your anatomy books as a separate structure, is not really a separate structure. It's just a thickening of that superficial fascia, the superficial body leotard that runs all around the body that we were talking about when we were looking at the how fascia is in the body. So here we are on the superficial front line, going in under this retinaculum and up the front of the leg. This is all the muscles of what's known as the anterior compartment. Tibialis anterior, extensor digitorum longus, and extensor hallucis longus, which are known as Tom, Dick, and Harry. So, having come up here to the top of that compartment, we are at the tibial tuberosity. If we keep going in a straight line, you can see this in the anatomy slide, that we get right onto the quadriceps femoris, and as we go up on the quadriceps, the most superficial of that quadriceps is the rectus femoris, and it includes the kneecap. So I've just taken this thing right around and stuck it to the whole kneecap, because the patella is a piece of a pulley. It actually exists within the quadriceps tendon, and we're on the superficial front line, so we'll take right up to the most superficial muscle here, the quadriceps, the rectus femoris, goes up here to the anterior inferior iliac spine. So we've made it up to the anterior inferior iliac spine here, and we're kind of stuck. There's no muscle that takes off from here except perhaps the iliacus, and that would carry us very deep. We want to stay on the superficial front line, and so here comes the fudge factor for the superficial front line. I'm going to jump over here, and I'll just stick this here for a second. I'm coming over to the pubic bone. This isn't really part of the line. There's nothing here. I'm not talking about the inguinal ligament or anything like that. But I am jumping from here to here, which isn't normally allowed in the anatomy trains. But let me show you what I mean on my own body here. The rectus femoris comes up the leg and to the anterior inferior iliac spine here. The rectus abdominis, which is going to be our next muscle, takes off from the pubic bone and goes up to the rib cage here. Now, if you look, these 2 points are on one bone, the iliac bone here, so the hip bone. So if I tighten the rectus femoris, I'm going to pull down on the rectus abdominis. For every millimeter that this shortens, this has to lengthen. And conversely, if I tighten the rectus abdominis, I am going to pull the rectus femoris into greater length. Okay? And likewise, if I stretch through the whole hip, I'm going to have to stretch both this and this as I stretch the superficial front line, as I would in, say, yoga pose like the cobra, or where I was reaching overhead on a shelf or something, or a bridge, any kind of a pose like that. So this works as an anatomy train as long as I stay right in the sagittal plane. If we're talking about twists, where you turn the body away from this superficial front line, doesn't connect through this area here. But if you're talking about a connection through the sagittal plane, through the plane of right through the front of the body, then the next piece, the rectus abdominis muscle, which comes up here to the fifth rib, and coming from the pubic bone, you can see the linear connection between these two. And as we come up onto the fifth rib, we get on to the sternalis fascia that runs under here. You can see this in the Vesalius slide from way back when, and also in the modern slides here. And the sternalis fascia carries you right up the sternal bone to the top of the sternal manubrium. Who takes off from here? The obvious muscles when you got up here to the sternum to keep going right up the front of the body would be these sternohyoid muscles. But look at the anatomy slide and you will see that these muscles actually go behind the sternum. And what muscles keep going on the superficial front plane? It's your sternocleidomastoid. So the superficial front line, if you follow the anatomy, actually goes up here onto the mastoid process, and then that connects also right up into the scalp. We'll give this one a little trim also. I suppose keeps right on going over the top, but for our purposes it will stop there. And now you can see the balancing answer to the superficial back line is the superficial front line, which balances it all the way up to, let's stick that down, to the the top of the rib cage here, and then look what happens. Look what happens. The superficial front line goes to the back, and in fact goes behind the atlanto-occipital joint where the head is joined to the neck. The result of this is if I tighten the sternocleidomastoid on this side, on both sides, I'm going to do this to the neck. If I tighten the superficial back line, I do this. If I tighten the superficial front line, I do this. So is it any wonder that this is one of the most common postural faults that you can see? Because the superficial front line and the superficial back line both pull the neck into hyperextension, which is something that we always are working on to try to get this to happen. And we're going to see that the only line that really counterbalances this and takes your neck into flexion is the deep front line. So at the, as we look at this superficial front line and we come to understand it, there's a piece about how people react to fearful situations that becomes really clear. If you, and you can see that here in the slide, if you stand behind somebody and surprise them, in this case somebody fired a blank gun behind this gentleman, before he was standing like this and after he was standing like this. So he was shortening the front of his torso and he was shortening the back of his neck. Now, when you see the superficial front line as a whole, you can see what this is. It's a shortening of the superficial front line. The reaction to stress is to return toward the fetal position, is to shorten the superficial front line and protect your body. But shortening the superficial front line shortens the front of the body up to here and then shortens the back of the neck, because that's the way the line runs. To recap then, from the top of the toes, underneath the retinaculum at the ankle, up the anterior compartment of the leg, through the kneecap, up the front of the thigh to the pelvis, jumping across to the rectus abdominis, up the chest on the sternalis fascia, onto the sternocleidomastoid, all together running up the front of the body in the superficial front line. As you can see, a stretch like this would stretch the superficial front line, a stretch like the cobra or the upward-facing dog. And here's a simple stretch for the superficial front line on one side.